Our Parsha of Re'Ay contains so many different mitzvot. I think it's the one that has the most mitzvot concentrated in one Parsha in the whole book of Devarim. So it's hard to pick out something. Um, so there are two things I want to talk about. The first, in a very short comment of the first pasuk of the parsha in a more philosophic way. But then the main part, for two reasons, has to do with the issue of eating meat. Um, Number one is probably in a half dozen places in the parsha. It talks about coming when people will come to Yerushalayim, the place where God will choose. It doesn't use the word Yerushalayim. Wherever God will choose to be the centralized location to bring korbanot. When they come, they bring the korbanot and they have a festive meal. And it mentions that v'samachta lifnei Hashem. You should enjoy yourself in God's presence with your whole family and with the poor and with the vulnerable in society. They give a whole list of people who you should have a community celebratory meal with in Yerushalayim when you bring the korbanot to Yerushalayim. Why it's relevant particularly to this parsha is, number one, it talks about all the times that you should come and have this kind of meal. But number two, it also, in this parsha, it gives a modification, a major modification of the idea of bringing korbanot. And when we get there, we'll talk about it. And the major modification is it allows people to eat meat, to shecht animals and eat meat, even if it's not a korban, even if you don't bring it to Yerushalayim and have this celebratory meal. So that very specific permission is sort of unexpected, but we'll see why Moshe mentions this modification. There's a good reason for it. Any case, so there's a number of things in this parsha woven together that have to do with eating meat. And what I want to contrast that with is if those of you who may follow one of these guys who does a blog trying to convince everybody that the Torah is against eating meat, that the vegans are correct, that one should not eat meat, and it's only given a temporary permission under certain circumstances to eat meat, but ideally one should not. And there's a number of reasons one should not eat meat, but they want to base it on the Torah. If they want to say, on health reasons or on ethical reasons, if you have these ethical issues, fine. But the issue is that many of these educated vegan supporters are trying to argue that the Torah wants us not to eat meat. And that becomes the issue. We're going to look at the sources and argue that the vegans really are not correct in saying that the Torah would rather that no one eats meat. That's not supported by the Torah, and we'll see why. In any case, let's go first to our little philosophical comment, which I'm saying because I think it's an important comment.
Excuse me, Steve, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why, if that's the case, why does the Torah specifically say what meats we are allowed to eat?
Well, because they argue that all this kashrut stuff and because that's also in the parsha, all the laws of kashrut are meant to be just giving in to necessity. Just like, for example, when we had a discussion way back in Vayikra, is how come the Torah allows people to bring animal offerings as korbanot? because korbanot was pagan worship. And the Torah is allowing us to have the same activity as the pagans do when they bring their sacrifices to their gods. We bring a sacrifice to our gods. So the answer the Rambam gives is, well, really, ideally, bringing animal sacrifices is not the ideal. The ideal would be prayer, which we eventually evolved into, but as a necessary median step, because you can't take away something from people who just don't know how to relate. Remember, the Rambam says, if you ask the Bnei Israel who came out of Egypt to pray to God and not bring any korbanot, they couldn't handle that. There's no such thing as talking to an invisible God and thinking that the God listens to you. It wasn't in their life experience. So this was a temporary necessity for people to bring korbanot. So it's the same thing here, that they argue, the vegans argue.
Okay, thank you. You too.
Um,
Okay.
Guys, turn off your microphone. That the vegans argue that eating meat in general, forget korbanot, but eating meat in general is a necessary condition because it's hard for people to do, but ideally you shouldn't. So that's their argument. So it's whether it's permissible or encouraged, or just grudgingly allowed, but it's wrong. That's what this argument is about. Okay, but before we get to that, let's get to our little theological issue here. The first line in the Parsha of Re'Ay, Re'Ay anochi noten lifnechem hayom bracha v'kal klala. I'm presenting you today conditions that will bring back a blessing, that will bring on a blessing, and will bring on a curse. Okay, and look at the Hebrew, et habracha, the blessing, asher tishmu el mitzvot Hashem Elokeichem, asher anochi mitzav etchem. The blessing is that, the word asher means that, is that you listen to the mitzvot of Hashem that I am commanding you today. The haklala, and the curse, im lo tishmu, if you disobey the commands of Hashem and turn from the way that I command you to this day. So there are two different words that introduce the consequences of bracha and klala. The consequence of bracha is asher tishma'u, and the consequence of klala is im lo tishma'u. So the commentators ask, why a difference in terminology? Why don't you say for both, either asher tishma'u or asher lo tishma'u, or use the other word im tishma'u or im lo tishma'u? In other words, why two different words for bracha and klala? Why not use the same? Because it's a parallelism. The rest of the pasuk is parallel. Okay, and here's where the nuance is critical. According to the Malbim was a contemporary of Hirsch, and Hirsch agrees. He says basically the same thing. He says the word asher, which we use for the blessing, implies that the very obedience to the mitzvot constitutes the blessing. That is, what's the bracha? In that you do the mitzvot. He compares it to the effect of a medication, to give an analogy. When a physician prescribes a pill to lower a patient's blood pressure, the lowered blood pressure is not due to the fact that the patient complied with the physician's orders. In other words, just because the patient said, okay, I will do what you ask, that in itself does not lower his blood pressure. What lowers it is the direct result of the ingestion of the medication. So in other words, what's the effect, with the good effect of lowering blood pressure? It doesn't come from obedience to the doctor. It comes from taking the pill. And that's what the Malbim says, the same thing here. the bracha comes not just from the fact that you listen to God and He's asking you to do it, but the real bracha, the essence of the bracha, comes from the act of doing the mitzvah. So too, the reward of a mitzvah is not due to obeying God in general, just like obeying the doctor, but is the product of the actual mitzvah deed, like the product of actually taking the medication. So when it comes to the bracha is the product of the actual mitzvah. Psychologically speaking, one could say that the sense of meaning and purpose, which is brought about by the conscious performance of a mitzvah, is an inherent byproduct of the act itself. In other words, what's the consequence of doing the mitzvah? Is when you say, let's say, Kiddush on Friday night, what's the consequence of proclaiming Shabbat at your Shabbat table? It's a sense of meaning and purpose of you proclaiming and inaugurating Shabbat at your table. So that's the payoff. The payoff is the sense of meaning and purpose and satisfaction you get from the mitzvah itself. And if you remember our discussion of what a blessing is in Akev that we just learned previously, we say a bracha is a statement of commitment to further God's purposes by doing the particular command. When you say Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotzav etzivanu, or when you say you make a bracha over food, or what the Torah in Akev is talking about when you do Birkat Hamazon, what you're doing is a mitzvah, but the sense of gratitude that you feel when you bench over the food that you've eaten is the result of the mitzvah itself. The fact that you v'achalta v'savata uveirachta, that you eat and are satisfied and then you bless God, that becomes the nature of the mitzvah. So what's the opposite? Is the same. Why not use the word asher for the opposite? Because the opposite doesn't work that way. One can argue that the negative effects of disobedience, in other words, your actual disobedience to the commandments, are not inherent in the act. Think about this for a minute. The pleasure of eating a delicious tasting non-kosher food is not an aversive experience. In other words, the act itself is not aversive, even though it's a prohibition. But the act itself is not an aversive act. You enjoy the food. Or if you successfully profit from being dishonest in business, in other words, you gain a profit by lying or being dishonest or by embezzling, that's not a curse as far as you're concerned. You're profiting. You get the money. You get the profit of the dishonest business practice. Or if you exploit the vulnerable to serve your purposes, that results in personal gain. So, in other words, the inherent act of not listening to God is actually rewarding to you. So you can't use that same word. You can't use the word that the act itself is the consequence, as you can use that word for the mitzvah. So what does it use? It uses the word im. So the conditional word im implies that the effect of the sin is the eventual outcome of the act, not the act itself, not inherent in it, because inherent in it is pleasurable for the moment. While the act may be inherently satisfying in the short term, the Torah says it is likely to bring about a sense of guilt or emptiness or meaninglessness in the long run. That's the eventual outcome. In other words, if you live a life of doing things that you're not supposed to do, it creates a negative psychological experience, and eventually that kind of guilt chips away at you, or your sense of meaninglessness of your life starts to come up. That's the consequence. And that consequence is not immediate. It's a longer term consequence. And so it uses the word im, which implies that it's not inherent in the act itself, but in the eventual outcome of living a life of violating all the prohibitions of the Torah's teachings. Okay, everybody get that?
Yes.
Okay. All right, now let's get to our main topic here. Is the Torah for or against eating meat? That's the question. Here's what the vegans or vegetarians argue. Are they correct? Is it immoral for a human being to take the life of a living animal merely for consumption? That's one of their arguments, that it's immoral for a human being to kill an animal just because you want to eat it. And they say it's unethical for a human to exert superior power against innocent, dumb animals. In other words, human beings are clearly have power over sheep and goats and cows. And is it unethical to exert your superior power? It is an act of cruelty to slaughter an animal for food, especially when there are healthier alternative diets available from the vegetable kingdom. After all, they argue, the human being was created herbivorous, meaning only eating vegetation,
Don't.
and was only grudgingly given permission by God to eat meat, which we're going to talk about. We'll talk about how that evolved. But this is their main arguments. Their main arguments is that there's an ethical and moral issue of killing animals just to eat them and to exert your power because you can. And number two is there's alternative diets. You don't need to eat meat.
Steve,
You can just eat vegetation. Yes.
they also argue that the conditions that chickens and cows and so on are being held are very cruel.
Yes. That's a different issue.
Very, very cruel. And I've seen articles in the paper about it. And when you read it,
You are right.
almost feel that you don't want to eat it.
Well, you are right, first of all, that the conditions in which animals are treated, if those things are true. Again, it's the vegans that usually argue about what's going on.
But they go to these places and they take photographs and whatever. So I presume it is true.
Okay, so let's assume it is true. The Torah itself tells you that that is immoral and unethical in another place, not in these issues, but it says tsar balei chaim, that is causing undue or unnecessary pain to a living thing is prohibited. So that's not this question. That question is absolutely right. Everybody agrees. Even meat eaters will agree that you cannot treat animals in such a way which is harmful or causing them pain, which you don't have to. Okay, so everybody agrees with that. This issue is, let's say that you're talking about the farms in the Golan in which the cows and the steers and so forth, where we get our local meat, are treated quite well, quite ethically. So that's not an issue. Now, the issue of how chickens are kept, some places do it right and some places do it wrong, and the places that do it wrong should be corrected by the Department of Health. So all of that, everybody agrees, shouldn't be, but that's not the same issue as all things being equal. If you don't have an issue with a mistreatment of an animal or a chicken, are you still allowed to eat it? That's the issue here.
Steve, it feels to me like a very lame argument. I feel like we need more and more proof, something more direct.
About what?
And about the argument that they're raising.
Well,
I understand what you're saying in the counter, but it just doesn't feel to me strong enough. But
well,
and I'm not such a fan of eating meat myself, but I'm just saying I don't see it.
Let's separate the two things. I just want to separate them. The first thing is the treatment of animals that are used for food. The Torah clearly prohibits causing undue pain. So that's issue number one that everybody agrees with. My question is, from the Torah's text itself, from the Torah's statements, is it inherently unethical or immoral to use animals for food? That's our issue. So we're going to take a historical sketch and take a look at what the Torah's attitude is towards that. In the creation story, we're told indeed, as the vegans and vegetarians will argue, that God gave humankind vegetation and fruit trees for food. In other words, originally, all human beings should consume only herbivorous plants and trees, so vegetation and fruit trees. Both humans and animals were herbivorous. Even animals didn't eat other animals at the point of creation. Unlike other life forms, though, in the same creation story, humankind was created in Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, which made it qualitatively different from the rest of animal nature. And as such, the human was given dominion over animal life. He was to harness the animal to serve human purposes. That's the text. Here's the text. God blessed the human being and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and transform it, have dominion over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the ground." In other words, God intended the human being to have dominion over all the rest of animal life because the human being was qualitatively different and was created with a divine element in that human being. Now, after Noah, it became concrete. After Noah, when Noah exited the ark after the flood with the family, God gives another command to Noah. He said, "The fear of you," that means all humankind from now on, "will be on every animal. Into your power they are given." Just like he said in creation, you should have dominion over all animals. Every creature that lives and moves about will be food for you. Now it's changed. Now, instead of being herbivorous, God says, human beings can eat all of these animals that it has power over, just as I gave you vegetation in the creation story. Now I give you everything to eat. So God himself changes the diet from herbivorous to omnivorous, that is, to eat both meat and vegetables. Okay, so the innate attachment. Now, the question is, why was this permission given? Why did God want us specifically to dominate animals and use it for our purposes? And Hirsch talks about it, and he says the innate attachment between human and beast after the flood needed to be broken. In other words, there was a reason that we should, after the flood, as human beings, have dominion or express our dominion over animals and use them for our human purposes. The new animosity between humans and animals served the constructive purpose of encouraging humankind to distinguish itself from beasts. In other words, the purpose is to show that human beings must retain the consciousness of a more noble and superior status in relation to the animal. In other words, the purpose of making us permitted or telling us to now eat animals is to distinguish ourselves from the beasts and to show us that we are superior to animals. And why is that important? Because the Torah, as if you're familiar with the laws, different laws of kashrut throughout the Torah keeps making the point that we are different from animals, that animals are instinctual, and animals just follow their biological needs for survival, and human beings who have a divine soul are different from that. And we are not to incorporate characteristics of animals, but rather we are to distinguish ourselves. And so take a look at some examples. There, at this point in history, animal meat, including birds and fish, that means that's what the pasuk said, may be eaten by people, but there's still two restrictions. And the restrictions are important. These are the early restrictions with right after Noach, in the time of Noach. A limb from a living animal, called in Hebrew Aver min hachai, is prohibited because that is animal behavior, not human behavior. If you've ever watched those horrendous films, the nature films, where a lion or a tiger or a cheetah or an alligator attacks an animal, they tear it. They take the living animal and just tear it apart. That is animal behavior, and that is human, and that is not human behavior, and therefore humans are not allowed to eat an animal in that way. That's Aver min hachai. Now, to us in our society, that wouldn't even enter our consciousness, but we're talking about a primitive society. The prohibition of eating blood is the second prohibition that's fundamental. Why? Number one, for the same reason that predatory animals, when they attack their prey, they eat it alive with its blood, with its lifeblood, and that is similarly predatory behavior. Just like tearing a limb from a living animal, so is eating animal blood. But on the more psychological and spiritual level, we may have discussed this in the past, I'm not sure, but pagan societies, many of the pagan societies, and still exist in some African tribes, will eat animal blood in order to incorporate the soul of the animal in them. In other words, if it's a lion, they will drink lion's blood and eat a lion's heart in order to become lion-like. Or if they want to have acuity of an eagle, they will drink the eagle's blood. The Maasai in Africa, to this day, Maasai drink the blood of animals in order to strengthen their sort of animal instinct in their hunting. Okay, so the Torah prohibits all of that. The Torah says we cannot incorporate the soul, as it were, or the instinct of an animal by drinking its blood, and therefore all blood has to be poured on the ground or removed before we're able to eat that. Both serve to differentiate the animal from the human. That's the point. The whole point of kashrut is to distinguish the animal instinct from the human who has a divine soul. With these two limitations, the eating of meat was not considered a moral or ethical violation. In other words, as long as it's not Aver min hachai, and as long as you don't eat the blood, then there's nothing wrong with eating the meat of animals.
Does this go back to transcending?
Yes, it does. You transcend the animal instinct, the biological animal instinct, correct. The stories of Abraham offering meat to guests and Yitzchak requesting venison as a favorite food are two examples of meat eating having no moral concerns. You can't say when Abraham had his guests, he offered them meat. If there was something wrong with that, then he wouldn't do that. And if Yitzchak, before he blessed, to give the blessing of the firstborn to Esav, he wanted to give it to Esav. He said to Esav, prepare the venison, which is my favorite food. You prepare that for me, and when I eat it, I'll see that you are giving me respect as their parent, and I will give you the firstborn's blessing. So we find also the eating of meat, as I mentioned before, as part of the korbanot system. In the service of achieving a closer relationship with God, which is what the korban system is supposed to be, the Torah sanctions the humane killing of edible kosher animals by ritual slaughter. That's one of the other required characteristics of kashrut, is the manner in which you kill the animal can't be like the predator does. You know the Hebrew word the Torah uses for predatory killing? Anybody know that word? I mean, you do know the word, but you may not think of it. The Torah's word for killing an animal like a predator is treifa, taref,
Ah,
treif. And it says, in the Torah says, treifa basadeh lo tochlu, a animal that was a predator tore apart, that you find you may not eat. You have to use shchita, which is a particular method of killing the animal in a humane way, showing that the human being is using this animal for proper ethical purposes. And similarly, and once you do that, then you can bring zevach shlamim. Zevach shlamim are those korbanot that you make a celebratory meal that's mentioned in this parsha of Re'Ay, of for Pesach and for the Chagim, shlosh pamim bashana, you bring a chagiga offering and you have a celebratory meal with family and friends and relatives and anybody that's there that comes with you to Yerushalayim. You have this big meal that you brought the Korban Pesach or the Korban Chagiga. In the desert, though, meat was eaten only in association with offerings of the sanctuary. In other words, when can you eat meat? As part of a korban. If you're not bringing a korban, you can't eat meat. You can't check the animal and eat it. Thus, the new nation learned that the act of eating meat was not only a human act, but also a spiritual act. In other words, eating meat was associated with something spiritual, was associated with korbanot. But here's where we come back to our parsha. When it comes to the people going into Eretz Yisrael and now living all over Eretz Yisrael, far away from the centralized Makom Asher Yivchar Hashem, which will be the place you bring your korbanot, eventually will be Jerusalem. So then the Torah here in our parsha makes another rule. In our parsha, Moshe announces that after the nation conquers Canaan and settles safely into the land, God will choose a place to establish a sanctuary, and only there is the nation is to bring its offering, the korbanot, v'samachta lifnei Hashem, and rejoice before God by having a festive meat meal. So in our parsha, Moshe reiterates, when you bring your korbanot, it has to be only in this place where the sanctuary is, and there you can eat meat as a festive meal. Okay, b'makom asher yivchar Hashem, l'shakein shmo, shama tavi et kol asher anochi mitzav etzchem, olotechem v'zivchehem, masrechem, et ramat yedchem, everything, all of these things that you have to bring, v'chol mivchar nidrechem asher tidru, there, all of your maser and all of your bikurim and all of the stuff that farmers bring as offerings, you have to bring to this central temple. Now comes Moshe with a new rule. Eat meat as you desire. We just said, Moshe has just taught, that you can only eat meat from korbanot, and you can only bring korbanot to the place that God will set up the sanctuary. So now he's going to modify that rule. A modification of these restrictions on eating meat only associated with offerings at the sanctuary is now presented in our text in Re'Ay. Ki yarchiv Hashem Elokecha es gvulecha. When God now expands your borders, in other words, all the different tribes go to their portion of Canaan. Kasher diber lach v'amarta ochla basar, and you say, the people, all these farming the communities say, we want to eat meat, kitav v'nafshecha le'echol basar, because we desire it, we want to eat meat. B'chol avat nafshecha tochal basar. So Moshe says, God is permitting you to eat as much meat as you desire. Ki yirchak mimecha makom. Why? Ki yirchak mimecha makom asher yivchar Hashem Elokecha lasim shemo sham. If you live far away from Jerusalem, if you're right there in Jerusalem, so then you bring your korban, and that's where you can eat your meat with your family. But what happens if you live in all the way up in Naphtali and Dan and all the way in the north? So what are you going to do there? So if you live far away, v'zavakta mibkarecha umitzonecha asher nasan Hashem Elokecha lecha kasher tzivisicha v'yachalta b'sharecha b'chol nafshcha b'chol avat nafshecha ach kasher yechel es hatzvi v'es ha'ayil kein tochalenu hatameh v'hatamor. You can, despite the fact, because you live far away and you can't come to the central location, I'm giving you permission to shecht your flocks, your sheep and your goats, and eat meat as much as you want. And more than that, if you come to the sanctuary, do you remember, anybody coming to the sanctuary has to be tahor. That's why when people came to the sanctuary with their korbanot, they had to go to the mikveh first, which is why there were hundreds of mikvahs all over the outskirts of Jerusalem, so people could dunk in a mikveh before they bring their korban, because you can't bring a korban without being tahor. But, says Moshe, here is the modification. If you're too far from the sanctuary, you can't bring your korbanot to there, then you can shecht an animal, and you don't have to be tahor. You can eat it even if you're tameh, just like you can eat wild animals that you don't bring to the korban. You don't bring a deer or a ram or a what do you call it? What's that other animal native to Israel with the horns? Anyway, the wild animals. You can eat the wild animals because they're kosher. They have a cleft hoof and they chew their cud, but they're not good for korbanot. You can't bring it for korbanot. So just like you can eat deer and you can be tameh because you're not bringing it as a korban, you can also eat flock, sheep and goats, which you can bring as a korban, but if you don't bring them as a korban, you can eat it even while you're tameh. The only restriction that still remains is rak chazak, but be very careful. Levilti achol hadam, ki hadam hu hanafesh. Don't eat the blood of any animal, because the blood is the instinctual soul of the animal. V'lo tochal hanefesh im habasar, and you don't eat the instinctual soul of an animal with its meat. So you can never, no matter what you eat, when you eat it, you can never eat the lifeblood of the animal. So that remains. And certainly Aver min hachai remains. And also the restrictions of not eating treifa, in other words, an animal that you find dead in the field that's torn by a predator, you can't eat. All of those are kashrut laws, and they still apply. But what it's telling you here is you no longer have to restrict the eating of a celebratory meat meal to bringing your korban to Yerushalayim. So Rabbi Hirsch points out the subtle attitude which with the Torah grants such a modification. So he says, this is not It says kol ta'avat nafshecha. Ta'avat means desire, because you say you really desire it, so I'm letting you do it. Okay, so Hirsch says, well, there's a subtle linguistic message here. If it only applies if you live a far distance from the sanctuary. In other words, if you're close enough to have your celebration at the sanctuary through one of the shlamim, through one of the korbanot that you bring, do it that way. But this permission only applies if you live a far distance and you can't travel there. And you have to have a significant craving for meat. In other words, you have to really desire, you have to really want it. And 3, you have to say, I need to eat this meat meal. In other words, it shouldn't be, the Torah is not telling you it's a mitzvah to eat meat. It's saying, under circumstances where you really enjoy meat and you have a craving to eat meat as in a celebratory meal with your family and friends, then that fulfills the conditions and then you can eat it.
Dave, I
Yeah.
have a question. Does anybody ever question why the term ta'avat nafshecha, why specifically we're using that word?
Because it's an idiom. Ta'avat nafshecha means your very self has a strong desire for something. A tava is a strong desire. You really, really want something.
Yeah,
What
I
about a
understand.
craving?
What?
Like a craving?
A craving, yes,
You
absolutely.
know, I understand that. It's just interesting that's linked to the word
Wait a second.
nefesh, soul.
Wait a second. That's going to come up in our sources. Hold on for a few minutes. You'll see.
Okay.
Now, meat was reserved for special occasions and was associated with the tables of the well-to-do. So Abraham serves his special guests, the ones who he sees, calf meat. In other words, because they're special guests and he wants to respect them and honor them as guests, he serves them meat. Yitzchak, as we mentioned, asked Esav for a delicacy of venison because he has a taiva, he has a craving for venison. It's his favorite food. So he asked Esav to bring it to him. Again, the implication is there's nothing wrong with that. In the prophets, we find Shmuel himself prepares a special portion of meat for King Saul. In other words, to honor the king, Shmuel himself prepares a cut of meat. Abigail, one of King David's wives, prepares a meat feast for King David in the book of Malachi. And the famous quote of Yeshaya, eat meat and drink wine, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die. In other words, eating meat and drinking wine is considered a celebration. So in none of these references is there any implication that there's anything unethical or immoral about serving or eating meat. The opposite, that you do that to show honor and respect to special guests or your people that you're serving.
Steve, I could see an argument for just saying that we really shouldn't eat meat, except on special occasions, holidays, Shabbat.
Have patience. We're going to get there. Hold on.
Okay.
Now, returning to our text, we can better understand the nuance of the terminology. Indeed, the eating of meat has been always associated with offerings brought to the sanctuary, often marking expressions of gratitude or joy. When you brought a shlamim, remember when we talked about shlamim, they are offerings of gratitude or of appreciation, and you share, part of the meat was given back to you to share with your family and friends who came with you to Yerushalayim. And certainly when you came 3 times a year, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, you brought a korban chagiga, which is a festive offering that again, you get the meat back, a cut of meat back, in order to share it as a meal with your family and friends. But with tens of thousands of people too far from the sanctuary to travel, especially if you want your friends and neighbors to join you in a celebration, how are they to celebrate special events? Now, even in biblical times, you had three circumstances in which there are special celebrations. There were no bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, so forget that. But weddings were always celebrations, birth were always celebrations, and circumcisions were always were also celebrations. So how do you celebrate? This is a special occasion. How do you celebrate with your family and friends if it's too far to bring a korban? And that's why the Torah here says this particular modification, that it's good to celebrate. We want you to celebrate these occasions. It's good, v'samachta, to be happy, and you can do it even if you can't travel to the sanctuary, but have celebrations in your local place by shechita of the animal and eating it together, and eating the kosher animal, obviously, in the right way. So the Torah, with empathy, gives permission to people who strongly desire to eat meat as part of a family's simcha, but cannot travel the distance to the sanctuary to enjoy a festive meat meal as part of a korban. So under such conditions and the proper preparation with shechita, meat may be eaten to one's satisfaction. In other words, that's what it was saying. Why do you have a need, a desire to have a meat celebratory meal? Because you want to celebrate, and you celebrate by eating meat. So you have a desire to have a meat meal as a celebration. It's not a celebration if you have a pita and some vegetables that you have ordinarily. And even on Shabbat, not every Shabbat did people could people afford to shecht meat and have meat. Although if you could, you did that in order to have meat and wine on Shabbat and holidays. But during the week, you didn't eat meat. You ate the vegetables that you grew as your regular diet. But if you have a simcha and you really want to make a special celebration, and you can't travel with everybody that you've invited to the sanctuary to Jerusalem, remember it could be a 2 or 3 day journey and people don't leave their farms for that amount of time. So the Torah says simcha is important, celebrating is important. You can do this by shechting a kosher animal and to eat meat to one's satisfaction. Thus the Torah does not inherently disapprove of meat eating, but encourages a festive meal at special occasions. There's the parentheses. It encourages a festive meat meal as a special occasion. So at the same time, the Torah clearly disapproves of eating meat in excess. Now, how do we know that? How do we know that the Torah disapproves of eating meat when you don't really need to? Remember the story in Bamidbar, when the Bnei Israel lusted after meat. Remember one of their many complaints. We want to go back to Egypt because we ate a pot of meat. Of course, they probably didn't eat any meat because the Egyptians didn't eat meat. But this is the way they change history. But they lusted. They say, we only have this junky manna. We only have mun. And it's not meat. We need meat to eat. So God allowed their gluttony to bring them to regurgitation in order to teach them a lesson. So that's what He did. This was the event at Kivrot Ta'ava. It uses that word Ta'ava as a lusting after something, a craving after something. You want it so much? Okay, I'll give you so much you're going to throw up. And that's what, in fact, He did. This is the quote. God heard when you wailed, if only we had meat to eat. We were better off in Egypt. Now, God, says Moshe, will give you meat and you'll eat it, but you'll eat it not for just one day, or 2 days, or 5 days, or 10 days, or 20 days, but for a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils and you loathe it, until you throw it up because you have rejected God who is among you. In other words, God is going to show them a lesson through gluttony that eating meat for the purpose of being a glutton, of having not serving any kind of constructive purpose, is disapproved of by God. And there's other references of disapproval. Amos, the prophet Amos, rebukes the rich who have ordinary meals, that is, weekday meals of lambs and calves. In other words, every night they have some other kind of meat. Proverbs says, don't be among the gluttonous eaters of meat. And remember our discussions of Kadoshim Tihiyu when the Ramban uses an example of gluttonous consumption of meat as an abuse of a permitted activity. Remember when the Ramban says, what does it mean, Kadoshim, you should be holy? It means even with things that are permitted. So yes, you're permitted to eat meat, but you can use that permission to turn into a glutton, and that is not holiness. Holiness is to act in a way which reflects your divine nature and not to become a glutton. So very clearly, the Torah does not want people to eat meat just as a gluttonous activity. In sum, taking all this together, we can see that the Torah neither forbids meat, so that's clear, it doesn't forbid it. It doesn't condone gluttony, nor does it advocate meat as a constant staple in our ordinary diet. It doesn't tell us to eat meat all the time. However, it recognizes the need for a special meat meal to mark festive occasions. So here you see that there's a line, a dotted line. It's not clear, at what point does it come to a constant staple of an ordinary diet out of a gluttonous need versus eating meat because you enjoy being with friends. Like if you go out to dinner and you go to a meat restaurant and you enjoy, everybody at the dinner table enjoys eating steak or enjoys eating sado or enjoys eating some chicken. So it's part of going out together as a social experience, not to be gluttonous. It's because you all enjoy eating together at a meat restaurant. That seems to be okay because the Torah doesn't forbid that, and it's not gluttonous. Okay, and it's not a staple diet. In other words, you don't have to eat meat every night of the week, but you're doing it when you go out, for example. So that would be okay. Clearly, we're not discussing, by the way, eating of meat in terms of protein or not eating meat as part of a diet for health reasons. The Torah has no association with issues of health. That's different than the Rambam. The Rambam says the whole kashrut is because non-kosher stuff is unhealthy. But all other people disagree with him and say it has nothing to do with health because the Torah does not legislate issues of health. If you don't like meat or you don't want to eat meat for dietary reasons, you just don't enjoy it, don't eat it. You don't have to. So the Torah is not legislating the fact that you eat meat, except on one occasion that it becomes a mitzvah. We'll talk about it in a second. We conclude, therefore, that the Torah did not forbid the eating of meat on moral and ethical grounds. That's the point. The Torah did not forbid the eating of meat on moral or ethical grounds, but encouraged its moderate use as a sign of celebration and festivity. Actually, in one circumstance, it is actually required as a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to eat meat according to Shulchan Aruch, rabbinic mitzvah. It's not a biblical one, but from Rambam through the Shulchan Aruch, through all of the legal codes, one should eat meat on festivals, on the Chagim, in order to fulfill the verse, V'samachta b'chagecha, that you should celebrate, you should enjoy your holiday, and the definition of enjoyment is with basar v'yayin, is eating meat and drinking wine. And therefore it became a halakhic, not so much an imperative, because if people just don't like wine or they don't like meat, you don't have to eat it on Yantif. It'll ruin your Yantif if you feel forced to drink wine or to eat meat. But if you like to celebrate, if you enjoy meat and wine, then you should actually make it part of your meal on the three Chagim, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Now, the one contemporary sort of exception to the rule is Rav Kook, Rav Avraham Yitzhak Cohen Kook, chief rabbi of Israel from before the state, and died in 1935. Within the mystical tradition, within the Kabbalistic tradition, Rabbi Kook believed that the granting of meat for human consumption was an indication of the broken harmony of the world and a reflection of humanity's moral disintegration. And he's right, according to the way we read that very first permission at the time of Noah for human beings to eat meat. Remember, we said, what's the purpose? In order to distinguish us from animals. We needed to distinguish us who have a divine soul from animals who are biological, instinctive beings. We don't want to be like them. So Rav Kook is basically saying the same thing. That was because there was a broken harmony. That was because human beings were prone to be animal-like. And the Torah wanted to discourage that, to keep human beings separate from animals, and that's why he allowed shechting of animals. So Rav Kook says, but in the messianic time, when there is no fear that human beings are going to be animal-like, because all human beings are going to be following their divine soul only, then we shouldn't have dominion over animals. Rabbi Kook's message is that we should not forget that meat eating is a temporary condition. This is from a Kabbalistic point of view, mystical point of view. It's a temporary condition brought about by humanity's demoralization. It was brought about by the reasons there had to be a flood in the first place. One day, in messianic times, humankind will once again be spiritually refined and realize the pristine conditions of harmony between human and animals, like it was in the Garden of Eden. And once again, both man and beast will eat herbs of the field and fruits of the trees, and korbanot. Still, there will be a korban system, but it'll only be grains and fruit, and there will be no animals brought for korbanot. So that is the one idealistic opinion, but everybody else is a bit less mystical and more down to earth in reality. And so the bottom line is there's nothing unethical or immoral about eating meat, but one should not be gluttonous. However, on the other hand, one should don't feel guilty in celebrating with friends and family by eating meat.
Right. Steve, but Rav Kook isn't saying that we shouldn't eat meat now, correct?
No, he was a vegetarian, and he said if you want to live like living in times of the messianic era, then you can choose not to eat meat even now because of its messianic association.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very good.
But by the way, he ate chicken on Shabbat. Other than Shabbat and Chagim, he was completely vegetarian. But because of the Torah's insistence that v'samachta b'chagecha, and that is eating meat, and then you should eat meat. He didn't eat meat. I think he ate only chicken.
And are we saying also the people arguing against eating meat, and they're including fish in that, or just meat?
No, just meat, because fish don't have to be shechted. It's not the same category.
God willing, we'll come to a time where we're not going to eat meat. The messianic time. I'm ready.